In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And one Sister of Battle handed the easiest assignment of her career. Go to a factory world, find the heretics, remind 34 million souls where their prayers belong. No xenos, no demons. The kind of posting veterans dread, because there is nothing more terrifying to a warrior of the God Emperor than becoming irrelevant. Hey, I'm your brother from the Void, and this is Tales from the Void. Today's story comes from Mathrada Grieve, Order of the Ashen Covenant, 11 years in service. She arrived on Nathraxa Septimus, certain that every order from her superiors was the Emperor's will made manifest. A little girl in a market handed her a clay figure and asked the Emperor to watch over her work. She kept it. She still has it. That was the beginning of the end of her certainty. Settle in. This is Tales from the Void. Let's begin.
They told me it would be a simple assignment. Compliance enforcement on a backwater industrial colony. 34 million souls drifting from the Emperor's light. And all I had to do was walk among them and remind them where their prayers belonged. No xenos, no demon incursion, no war zone. Just faith maintenance on a world that manufactured bolt casings and lass power cells for 17 subsectors. The kind of posting that Sororitas veterans whisper about in the refectory with barely concealed dread, because there is nothing more terrifying to a warrior of the God Emperor than the prospect of becoming irrelevant. My name is Mathrada Grieve, Sister of Battle, Order of the Ashen Covenant, 11 years in service to the Ecclesiarchy at the time of my deployment to Nathraxa Septimus. I carried with me a Godwin Diaz pattern bolter, blessed by the abbess of our convent on Veridicia 3. A suit of ceramite power armor, inscribed with 219 verses of the Feda Imperialis, and the unshakable certainty that every task given to me by my superiors was the Emperor's will made manifest through mortal chain of command. I want you to remember that. Remember how certain I was. Because certainty is the sharpest blade the Imperium gives its servants. And I have since learned that the sharpest blades are the ones that cut you when you least expect it. I was not alone. 6 of us were dispatched from the Order's priory on Veridicia 3, aboard the bulk carrier Wrathful Deliverance, which was hauling munitions to the Orphelian front. Nathraxa Septimus was a scheduled resupply stop along the warp corridor, and we were to disembark there while the carrier continued on its route. My squad comprised Sister Superior Eloine, who led us with the methodical precision of a woman who had catalogued every sin she had ever witnessed and filed them in alphabetical order inside her skull. There was Sister Phaedra, our heavy weapons specialist, broad-shouldered and quiet in a way that made you pay attention when she did speak. Sister Cassine, who had trained as a dialogus before transferring to the Order's militant and could recite imperial law from memory faster than most adepts could read it. Sister Tuvia, youngest among us at 23 standard years, fierce and hungry to prove herself in ways that made the rest of us feel old, and Sister Galeth, our team medic with hospitaler cross-training, whose steady hands could suture a wound or pull a trigger with equal composure. 6 sisters, 1 backwater colony, a simple job. The warp transit took 41 days. I spent most of it in the ship's chapel, a cramped metal room bolted to the lower cargo deck that the crew had furnished with a scratched aquila and stained prayer cloths. The carrier's crew were rough men and women, tattooed with guild marks, but they knelt beside us for evening devotions without complaint. That meant something to me then. The idea that even the lowest laborer in the Imperium still bent their knee to the Emperor. I prayed with them every evening, and when the transit ended and Nathraxa Septimus filled the viewing port, I felt ready. The planet looked like a bruise, mottled grey-brown continents under a permanent haze of industrial discharge. The atmosphere stained yellow at the edges where chemical waste met the upper winds. There were no oceans, only vast alkaline flats where moisture collected between the factory districts, the liquid thick and white as bone. The cities, if you could call them that, were visible from orbit as dark geometric scabs on the planet's surface, connected by rail lines and supply corridors that stretched across hundreds of kilometers of empty steppe. There was no green anywhere, not a single shade of it. Sister Tuvia, who had grown up on a garden world before she was taken by the Schola Progenium, pressed her face against the viewing port and said nothing for a very long time. We made planetfall at landing platform Sigma 18, the colony's primary transit hub, which serviced the capital district of Calreth. The platform was enormous, designed to receive heavy landers carrying raw materials, and our shuttle looked like an insect perched on a dining table. The air hit us when the ramp dropped, hot, dry, tasting of calcium dust and machine lubricant. Everything was beige. The landing platform, the buildings beyond it, the sky above, the uniforms of the labor crews who watched us descend with wide eyes and slack jaws. They had never seen Sororitas before. I could tell by the way they looked at us, at our black and silver power armor, at the weapons maglocked to our thighs, at the fleur-de-lis etched into our pauldrons. To them, we were something from a cathedral fresco that had stepped off the wall and started walking. Prefect Luda Carnas met us at the base of the platform. She was the colony's civilian administrator, a tall woman with cropped grey hair and the augmetic left eye that marked her as a former administratum clerk promoted beyond her original pay grade. Her uniform was immaculate, pressed to knife-edge creases, and she wore the colony's emblem, a cogwheel encircling a bolt casing, pinned precisely over her heart. She greeted us with the formal obeisance required when receiving agents of the Ecclesiarchy, one knee down, head bowed, the correct phrasing and everything. But her good eye, the real one, watched us the way a hab-block stray watches a passing enforcer, careful, measuring, trying to calculate whether we were a threat or just passing through. "Sister Superior," she said to Eloine, rising to her feet. "Nathraxa Septimus is honored by your presence. The Diocese of the Orphelian Reach has informed us of your mission, and we are prepared to render full cooperation."
The Emperor asks. We answer. So too shall you, Eloine replied, which was her way of saying thank you.
The briefing took place in the prefect's administrative tower, a squat ferrocrete structure in the center of Calreth that overlooked the main factory complex stretching to the southern horizon. The room was functional. A hollow table, hard chairs, recycled air that tasted of the same dust as outside, but colder. Carnas laid out the situation with bureaucratic efficiency. Nathraxa Septimus had been flagged 18 months prior by a visiting missionary of the Missionarius Galaxia, one Father Corvin Dreth, who had spent 6 weeks touring the colony's labor districts and filed a report upon his return to the diocesan seat on Orphelia Tertius. The report described widespread heterodox worship practices among the population. Specifically, the workers of Nathraxa Septimus had incorporated local traditions into their observance of the Imperial Creed, traditions that predated the colony's founding and had their roots in the original settlement ships that brought the first colonists here 3,000 years ago. The traditions, as Karnas described them, were not extreme. The workers sang specific hymns during shift changes that were not found in any approved imperial hymnals. They kept small clay figures in their hab units, rough humanoid shapes with elongated arms, which they called labourers of the throne, and believed represented the emperor in his aspect as a worker and builder. During the annual founding festival, the population performed a ritual called the laying of hands, where senior workers placed their palms on the factory machines and recited prayers for continued function. They also buried a single bolt casing with their dead, a symbolic offering representing the departed's contribution to the Imperium's defense. None of this was violent. None of it invoked names other than the Emperor's. None of it involved mutation, unsanctioned psychoactivity, or any contact with xenos influence. But Father Dreth's report had used the word heterodox 11 times and the word deviant 7 times, and that was enough. The Diocese of the Orphelian Reach forwarded the report to the Synod. The Synod flagged it for Sororitas intervention, and 6 months later we were standing in a dusty briefing room on a dusty world being told to root out heresy that didn't look like heresy, but apparently was. Eloine accepted the mission parameters without question. That was her way. Orders were orders, and orders from the Ecclesiarchy were the Emperor's voice filtered through mortal throats. We were given quarters in the administrative tower, clean rooms with cots and a shared prayer chamber that Karnas had outfitted with fresh devotional candles and a polished aquila that still smelled of metal lacquer. I remember kneeling before that aquila on our first night, reciting the litany of vigilance while the colony hummed around us, millions of people working the night shift in factories that never stopped. The vibration came up through the floor and into my knees. It felt like a heartbeat, like the planet itself was alive and breathing. We began our work the next morning. The approach was standard Sororitas compliance doctrine. We split into 3 pairs and rotated through the colony's 12 primary labour districts over the first 2 weeks, observing worship practices, interviewing district overseers, inspecting hab unit shrines, and attending the public devotions held in the colony's 42 small chapels. I was paired with Cassine, whose knowledge of imperial canon law made her invaluable for identifying deviations. We moved through the districts methodically, always in full armor, always armed. We were not there to blend in. We were there to be seen. The people of Nathraxa Septimus were not what I expected. They were not sullen or resentful, the way populations sometimes are when the Ecclesiarchy sends enforcers. They were curious, respectful, even eager. Workers would stop in the corridors to kneel as we passed, touching their foreheads and murmuring, "By the throne," in that clipped accent that all the colonists shared. Children gathered at a distance, whispering and pointing, not in fear, but in wonder. One girl, no more than 8 standard years, approached me in the market district of Calreth's 3rd labour zone and held out a small clay figure. One of the labourers of the throne, she offered it to me as a gift. "For you, holy sister," she said, "so the Emperor watches your work." I took it. I should not have. Compliance protocol was clear. Unsanctioned devotional objects were to be confiscated and logged, not accepted as gifts. But the child's face was so earnest, so full of the simple faith that I had spent my entire life defending, that I took the little figure and nodded to her, and she ran off beaming, as though she had just received a blessing from a living saint. I still have that figure. Even now, years later, I keep it in my kit. It sits in the bottom of my armor's transit case, wrapped in a piece of cloth cut from a prayer banner. I have never shown it to anyone. I have never told anyone about it, but I cannot bring myself to throw it away, because that little girl's face is burned into my memory as clearly as any battlefield, and the faith I saw in her eyes was as real and as pure as anything I have ever witnessed in a cathedral on Terra. The first weeks passed without incident. We documented the heterodox practices, catalogued the variant hymns, photographed the clay figures, recorded the laying of hands ritual when a district performed it to mark the installation of a new conveyor system. Everything was logged and transmitted to the diocesan seat for review. The local religious authority, Deacon Hesketh, cooperated fully. He was an aging man, 67 standard years, with a gentle voice and a limp from a factory accident in his youth. He had served as the colony's senior cleric for over 30 years and knew every chapel, every prayer leader, every tradition by heart. He met with Eloine daily to discuss our findings and answered every question with patient honesty. "These traditions predate my tenure," he told us during one of those sessions, while I stood guard at the chamber door and listened. "They predate my predecessor's tenure. The laying of hands has been practiced here since the colony's 3rd century. The hymns are older still, brought by the founding ships from their world of origin, which no longer exists in Imperial records. I have served this flock for 3 decades, and I have never seen the faith waver. Not once. They work, they pray, they give their tithes, they die with the Emperor's name on their lips. If that is heresy, then I confess I do not understand the word." Eloine listened to this the way she listened to everything, impassively, without comment. And then she told the deacon that we would begin corrective measures the following week, as per our mandate, and that his cooperation would be noted in our final report. Hesketh nodded. He did not argue. He had been in the Ecclesiarchy long enough to know that arguing with a sister of battle was like arguing with a bolter round. You could object to its trajectory all you wanted, but it was still going to hit you. The corrective measures began in the 3rd week. We confiscated the clay figures first. Every HAB unit in every labour district was searched, and the labourers of the throne were collected in plastic crates and transported to a furnace yard on the colony's western perimeter, where they were destroyed. The workers watched this happen. They stood in the corridors outside their HABs and watched us carry their devotional objects away, and they did not resist, did not protest, did not even speak. They just watched with an expression I have seen many times since, an expression that is not anger and not despair, but something between the two. A dull recognition that the universe has decided to take something from you, and there is nothing you can do about it. Some of the older workers wept, quietly, without sound, the tears cutting lines through the dust on their faces. I remember one man, a furnace operator named Vosh, who was perhaps 50 standard years old, with hands like leather gloves, standing in his doorway, watching Cassine place his family's figure, a piece that had been in his lineage for 6 generations, into a collection crate. He looked at me, and I looked at him, and for a moment something passed between us that I cannot describe. Not hostility, not pleading, just a question. A simple, wordless question that I could not answer then and struggle to answer now. Why? We moved to the hymns next. The unauthorized songs were banned. Approved hymnals were distributed. The colony's choir leaders were retrained under Cassine's supervision. The laying of hands was reformulated as a standard rite of maintenance blessing, approved by the cult Mechanicus, with the local elements stripped out and replaced with canonical phrasing. The workers could still touch the machines and pray, but the words and the meaning were no longer theirs. By the 6th week, compliance was effectively achieved. The colony was clean. The heterodox practices were gone, replaced by approved doctrine. The chapels sang the right hymns. The hab units were free of unsanctioned figures. The rituals conformed to ecclesiarchal standard. Father Dreth's concerns had been addressed. Our mission was technically complete, but we did not leave. The order to remain came from the diocesan seat itself, from Bishop Valdron Thrace, who oversaw the Orphelian Reach from his palace on Orphelia Tertius. The message was brief and carried the bishop's personal seal. Remain on station, continue observation, further instructions to follow. No explanation, no timeline, no context, just remain. Eloine accepted this without question, as she accepted everything. The rest of us settled in for what we assumed would be a few additional weeks of monitoring. We continued our patrols, our inspections, our attendance at chapel services. The colonists had adapted to our presence by now. The children no longer gathered to stare. The workers nodded respectfully when we passed, but did not stop to kneel. We had become part of the landscape, furniture, background noise. It was during this period of extended observation that I began to notice things. Small things at first. Karnas, the prefect, had a habit of receiving encrypted vox transmissions at irregular hours. Her augmetic eye, which I had initially assumed was a simple optical replacement, had a faint green pulse in its iris that activated during these calls, suggesting a built-in recording function that went beyond standard administratum issue augmetics. The colony's tithe records, which Kessine reviewed as part of our compliance audit, showed consistent shortfalls in bolt casing production that did not match the factory output logs. Someone was skimming. Not much, perhaps 2% of total output, but consistently and over years, which meant tens of millions of bolt casings had gone somewhere that was not the Departamento Munitorum's supply chain. And then there was the archive. Every imperial colony maintains a records archive, a repository of founding documents, administrative orders, ecclesiarchal decrees, population records, and historical logs. On most worlds, these archives are maintained by the administratum and accessible to any imperial authority with the proper credentials. On Nathraxa Septimus, the archive was housed in a sealed vault beneath the administrative tower, and when Kessine requested access as part of our compliance documentation, Karnas told her it was undergoing recataloguing and would be available within the month. Kessine accepted this. I did not. I am not, by nature, a suspicious woman. I was raised in the Schola Progenium on Haldris IX, and from there I was taken by the order of the Ashen Covenant at the age of 14. For 11 years I had lived a life of prayer, training, and obedience. Suspicion was not encouraged in the Sororitas. We were instruments of the Emperor's will, not investigators. But something about Karnas's refusal, about her careful, measured cooperation that always seemed to stop one step short of full transparency, planted a seed in my mind that I could not uproot. And so, on the 43rd night of our deployment, while the rest of my squad slept and the colony hummed its endless industrial lullaby, I went to the archive. Power armor was never built for stealth, but I did not need stealth. I needed cover. The factory vibration that ran through every wall and floor of the administrative tower swallowed the soft whine of my servos as completely as deep water swallows a dropped stone. I moved carefully, deliberately, taking the empty corridors and the maintenance staircases instead of the main routes. The tower's night watch was light, 2 human guards on the ground floor whose patrol cycles I had memorized over the previous weeks without intending to, and my route to the archive sublevel did not cross theirs. The lock on the archive vault was a standard administratum cipher mechanism. I had expected more, but I understood why as I worked the override codes. Better security would have drawn attention. Reinforced locks on a backwater archive would have appeared in maintenance budgets, requisition logs, inspection reports. Karnas's defense was not physical. It was procedural. A bureaucratic excuse, a sealed door, and the gamble that no one would have a reason to try the lock. The vault opened in under 3 minutes and I stepped inside. The archive was larger than I expected. Rows of data shelves stretching back into the darkness, stacked with memory cores, parchment bundles, and crystalline storage rods. Everything was coated in a fine layer of dust that told me the recataloguing Karnas had mentioned was not happening, and had not happened for a very long time. It took me nearly an hour of searching by the light of my armor's lamp pack before I found what I was looking for. Section Epsilon Rho, subsection 41, Ecclesiarchal Decrees and Diocesan Correspondence, dating from the colony's founding to the present era. The shelves here were packed tight with slate folders, each one sealed with wax and stamped with the diocesan crest of whichever bishop had been in authority at the time of filing. I started with the oldest materials and worked forward, scanning each folder's date stamp and subject heading. Most of it was routine: tithe assessments, clergy appointments, chapel construction permits, liturgical calendars, the bureaucratic skeleton of faith, dry and unremarkable. But then, 7 folders deep into the 3rd century after founding, I found a document that made me stop. It was a decree. Formal ecclesiarchal parchment, thick and cream-coloured, with gilt lettering and the personal seal of Archbishop Malleus Gorvain. He had served as the head of the Orphelian diocese from approximately 577 M39 to 634 M39. The decree was dated 591 M39, and its language was unmistakable. Archbishop Gorvain formally recognized and sanctioned the local worship traditions of Nathraxa Septimus as legitimate expressions of the imperial creed. The labourers of the throne figures were classified as approved devotional objects under Canon 447 of the Ecclesiarchal Code. The founding hymns were granted status as authorized liturgical music specific to the colony. The laying of hands ritual was acknowledged as a localized form of the rite of machine blessing, compatible with both ecclesiarchal and mechanicus doctrine. The decree even included a theological justification, written by the Archbishop himself, arguing that the emperor's light manifested differently in different cultures, and that the traditions of Nathraxa Septimus were evidence of sincere devotion, not deviation. The document was countersigned by the Diocesan Synod. 12 signatures, notarized by the administratum, filed in the colonial archive as required by law. These people were not heretics. They had never been heretics. Their traditions had been formally approved 400 years ago by the highest religious authority in the sector, and that approval had never been rescinded, never challenged, never overturned. Every figure we confiscated, every hymn we silenced, every ritual we reformulated had been done to practices that the ecclesiarchy itself had declared legitimate centuries before any of us were born. I stood in that archive for a long time. I do not know how long. The data slate in my gauntlet recorded the time, but I did not look at it. I unsealed my helm and set it on the shelf beside me, because what I held in my hands deserved to be read with naked eyes and not through visor lenses, and I held the decree and read it again, and then a third time, because part of me refused to believe what I was seeing. Part of me insisted that there had to be an error, a forgery, some explanation that would make the last 6 weeks of my work on this world make sense. Because if this document was real, and it was real, I could feel the age of the parchment, smell the ancient ink, see the authentic watermarks of the Archbishop's office. Then what we had done was not compliance enforcement. It was something else entirely, something that tasted like ash in my mouth and sat in my stomach like a stone. I took the decree. I should not have. I should have reported my findings to Eloine through proper channels and let the chain of command process the information. But I did not trust proper channels anymore. Not after realizing that someone, somewhere in that chain, had either known about this decree and chosen to ignore it, or had deliberately concealed it to justify our deployment. Either possibility was a betrayal of everything I believed in. So I took the original parchment, sealed it in my armor's document pouch, resealed my helm, and left the archive. I re-engaged the lock behind me, and I went back to my quarters and knelt before the Aquila and tried to pray, but the words would not come. The next morning, I brought my findings to Eloine. I did this privately, in her quarters, with the door sealed and the vox dampener active. I laid the decree on her cot and stepped back and watched her read it. Her face did not change. Eloine's face never changed. She could have been reading a supply manifest or a death sentence, and her expression would have been identical. That flat, focused concentration that I had admired for years, and that now, in this moment, frightened me. She read it twice. Then she set it down and looked at me. "Where did you find this?" "The archive. Section Epsilon Row."
The archive that the prefect said was closed for recataloguing.
"Yes. You entered without authorization."
I did.
Eloine was quiet for a moment. She picked up the decree again, examined the seals, ran her thumb over the Archbishop's signature. Then she folded it carefully and placed it back on the cot. "Sister Mathrada," she said. "Our orders come from Bishop Thrace. The bishop's authority supersedes a 400-year-old decree from a dead archbishop. If the bishop determined that the practices of this colony warranted correction, then they warranted correction, regardless of what permissions may have been granted in a previous era. The Ecclesiarchy is a living institution. What was sanctioned yesterday may be condemned today. That is not a contradiction. That is the faith adapting to the Emperor's will as it unfolds through time." I listened to this and understood it. She was not wrong. The Ecclesiarchy did evolve, did update its positions, did occasionally reverse previous rulings. But there was a process for that. A formal rescission, an updated decree, documentation. None of that existed here. There was no record of Gorvain's approval being overturned, no subsequent ruling that reclassified the colony's traditions as heterodox. The only thing that existed was Father Dreth's report, filed 18 months ago by a travelling missionary who had spent 6 weeks on the planet, and Bishop Thrace's order to correct what Dreth had found. No legal review, no canonical assessment, no consultation with the diocesan records, just one man's opinion and one bishop's stamp. I said this to Eloine. I said it carefully, respectfully, in the language of a subordinate raising a legitimate doctrinal concern. She listened, and when I was finished, she told me to return the decree to the archive, to speak of it to no one, and to continue my duties as assigned. The matter was above our station, she said. If there was an irregularity in the chain of authorization, it would be resolved by authorities higher than us. Our role was to obey, I returned the decree to the archive. I obeyed. But I made a copy first, transcribed by hand onto a blank parchment from my personal kit. Every word, every signature, every seal described in detail. I folded that copy into a tight square and tucked it into the lining of my body glove against the skin of my lower back, where it would not show under my armor. I did not know yet what I would do with it. I only knew that I could not let this disappear. The weeks that followed were the worst of my life, not because of combat, not because of danger, but because of the terrible, ordinary rhythm of continuing to do something you know is wrong. We were still on station, still patrolling, still inspecting, still attending chapel services where the colonists sang the approved hymns with voices that had lost something I could not name. A brightness, maybe, an ease. The old hymns had been sung with a kind of joy that came from deep ownership, from generations of voices layering meaning into melody. The new hymns were sung correctly, but without that warmth. The notes were right. The spirit was absent. I began spending time with the colonists beyond my duty hours. This was unusual for a sister of battle. We were not encouraged to fraternize. Our role was enforcement, not fellowship. But something about the decree, about the knowledge it represented, had cracked open a door in me that I could not close. I wanted to understand these people, their traditions, their faith, not as deviations to be catalogued, but as expressions of something real. I visited the factory floors. The primary output was bolt casings, millions per week, stamped from sheets of tungsten alloy in massive presses that shook the buildings they were housed in. The secondary lines produced LAS power cells, compact energy units destined for the Astra Militarum across 17 subsectors. The work was hard, repetitive, and dangerous. The presses ran at temperatures that could melt ceramite, and the last cell assembly required handling volatile compounds that caused skin lesions and respiratory damage over prolonged exposure. Workers wore basic filtration masks and protective aprons, but the equipment was old and the medical facilities understaffed. The average life expectancy on Nathraxa Septimus was 46 standard years. Most workers began their shifts at age 12. I walked those floors, and for the first time in my career, I truly saw these people. Not as a population statistic, not as a flock to be guided. I saw hands cracked from chemical burns reaching into machinery with the precision of long practice. I saw faces grey with dust, still finding energy to smile at a colleague's joke during a water break. I saw a mother on the night shift crossing paths with her daughter on the day shift, the two of them exchanging a brief touch of hands and a murmured prayer at the changeover, each wearing the same exhaustion like a garment they could never take off. Vosh, the furnace operator whose family figure I had watched Cassine confiscate, found me standing near his station one evening. He was a large man, quiet by nature, with deep-set eyes that had the permanent squint of someone who had spent decades staring into heat. He did not ask why I was there. He simply stood beside me and watched his crew work the furnace line, 8 men and women feeding raw alloy into the crucibles with long-handled tongs. "My grandmother made that figure," he said after a while. He did not look at me when he spoke. "Her grandmother made the one before it. 6 generations of labourers in my family's keeping. When I was a boy, my father told me the Emperor works alongside us, not above us, not watching from a distance. Alongside. Hands in the metal, sweat on his brow. That's what the figures meant. That he understood what it cost to serve." I did not respond. I did not know how to. So I stood there beside him and watched the furnaces burn, and I felt the heat on my face even through my helm, and I said nothing because there was nothing I could say that would undo what had been done. Deacon Hesketh invited me to evening prayer in his personal chapel, a small room in the colony's oldest building, a structure that dated back to within a century of the founding. The chapel was simple: stone walls, a wooden floor worn smooth by centuries of kneeling, a single window of coloured glass that cast fragments of light across a plain altar. Hesketh prayed there every evening, alone, and he extended the invitation to me with the quiet courtesy of a man who understood that I was struggling with something and had decided to offer help without asking what the something was. We prayed together. The approved prayers, the standard litanies, nothing heterodox, nothing deviant. But Hesketh prayed them differently than I had ever heard them prayed. He spoke each word as though he meant it not as recitation, but as conversation, as though the Emperor were in the room with us, sitting in one of the worn wooden chairs, listening. There was no performance in it, no theatrical piety, just an old man talking to his God with the familiarity of a lifelong relationship. When we finished, he offered me a cup of recaf from a battered flask, and I accepted, and we sat in silence for a while. "You found something in the archive," he said. It was not a question. "The decree, I think. Gorvain's decree." I looked at him sharply. He met my gaze with calm brown eyes. "I know every document in that archive, sister. I have read them all. Archbishop Gorvain's decree is the most important paper on this planet. And you have been behaving like a woman whose certainties have been taken from her. You visit factory floors instead of conducting patrols. You come to pray with a local deacon instead of reporting to your superior. Something broke your conviction, and only one thing in that archive has the power to do it." "You knew. All this time, you knew our mission was based on a false premise." "I knew that your mission was ordered by Bishop Thrace, and that Bishop Thrace either did not know about the decree or chose not to acknowledge it. I am a deacon. I do not have the authority to contradict a bishop. I could only wait and hope that someone with the capacity to act would discover the truth." "And you thought that someone would be me?" He smiled. It was a tired smile, old and sad. "I thought it would be one of you. A soldier of the faith, confronted with evidence that the faith has been misapplied. That is a crisis, sister. A crisis requires a decision. I could not make that decision for you. I could only pray that the Emperor would guide you to the archive, and he did." I wanted to be angry with him. Part of me was angry. He had let us do our work for weeks, let us confiscate the figures and silence the hymns, knowing all along that we had no canonical authority to do so. People had wept. Traditions had been destroyed. And he had said nothing. But the anger did not sustain itself, because I understood his position. He was one old man in a hierarchy that stretched across star systems. What could he have done? Who would have listened? The answer, I was beginning to realize, was no one. Because the decree's concealment was not an accident. Someone had buried it. The archive was sealed, officially closed for recataloguing that was never happening. Karnas controlled access to the building. Karnas, who received encrypted transmissions at odd hours. Karnas, whose tithe records showed a 2% production shortfall that went nowhere the administratum could track. Karnas, who had greeted us with perfect protocol and cooperated with perfect precision and never once mentioned that the colony's traditions had been officially sanctioned 4 centuries ago. I did not confront her. Not yet. I needed to understand the full picture before I acted, and the picture was still incomplete. Why would a colonial prefect conceal a religious decree? What did she gain from having the Sororitas enforce compliance against practices that were already legal? The production shortfall was interesting, but not conclusive. Skimming 2% of bolt casing output was a crime, certainly, but it was the kind of crime that happened on every industrial world in the Imperium, and was usually handled by the Administratum's own enforcement division, not by the Ecclesiarchy. There had to be something else, some connection I was not seeing. It was Cassine who found it. She had continued her review of the colony's administrative records as part of our extended observation mandate, and she came to me one evening with a data slate and an expression that I had never seen on her face before. Cassine, the former dialogus, the woman who could recite imperial law from memory, looked shaken. "The production shortfall," she said. "I traced it. The missing bolt casings are not missing. They are being rerouted through a secondary logistics chain to a collection point in the outer system, a decommissioned refueling station in the asteroid belt. From there, they are picked up by private haulers operating under rogue trader charter, and their destination after that is listed as classified under diocesan authority." Diocesan authority. Bishop Thrace. Bishop Thrace. I sat down. The implications were immediate. Thrace was skimming bolt casings from this colony and routing them through a private supply chain to a destination he classified under his own authority. The colony's traditions, the Sororitas deployment, all of it was camouflage. By sending us here to enforce religious compliance, Thrace had given the colony something to focus on, something that kept everyone looking at the chapels, while the real crime happened in the logistics chains. Karnas had sealed the archive to prevent anyone from discovering the decree that would undermine our justification. She had cooperated perfectly because our mission served her purposes. We were not enforcers. We were a distraction. The faith I had sworn to protect was being used as a weapon against the very people it was supposed to serve, and I had been the hand that wielded it. I spent 3 days deciding what to do, 3 days of patrols and inspections and prayers that felt hollow in my mouth, 3 days of looking at Eloine and wondering whether she had reached the same conclusions I had, 3 days of watching Karnas move through her administrative routines with that careful, measuring eye and knowing what lay behind it. Cassine and I spoke only in private, in whispered conversations during patrol rotations when we were certain our Vox channels were clean. She had made copies of the logistics data, encrypted on a personal slate that she kept in her armor, the same way I kept the transcribed decree against my skin. We decided to wait, not out of cowardice, but out of tactical necessity. We were 6 sisters on a world controlled by someone who was running a black market supply operation under the protection of a bishop. We had no allies we could be certain of, no way to send an encrypted astropathic message without it being intercepted by the colony's communications array, and no authority to act outside our original mandate. If we confronted Karnas, she would deny everything and contact Thrace, and we would be recalled, reassigned, possibly silenced. If we went to Eloine, she would follow the chain of command, which led back to Thrace. Every path through the hierarchy looped back to the man who had sent us here in the first place. So we waited. And the waiting might have continued indefinitely, might have stretched into weeks or months of quiet documentation and careful planning, if the Drukhari had not chosen that particular moment to announce their interest in Nathraxa Septimus. The attack came at shift change, during the brief window when the colony's population was maximally exposed in the open corridors and transit ways between the hab blocks and the manufactorums. It was precisely timed. The Drukhari do not attack carelessly. They study their prey, calculate the moment of greatest vulnerability, and strike with a surgeon's precision because their raids are not about conquest. They are about harvest. The first sign was the sound, a high, keening shriek that cut through the industrial hum of the colony like a blade through silk, rising in pitch until it seemed to vibrate in the bones of your skull. I was in the market district of the 3rd Labour Zone, returning from a routine patrol, and I knew what that sound was before my tactical display confirmed it. Every Sister of Battle is trained to recognize the engine signature of a Drukhari raider craft. It is one of the first xenos threat profiles loaded into our combat cogitators. The sound of those engines is etched into our muscle memory alongside the prayers we recite when we hear it. I was running before I finished the first line of the Litany of Righteous Fury. My bolter was in my hands, released from my thigh plate, and I was screaming into the vox for my squad to rally. Around me, the colonists were frozen, caught in the open, their faces turned skyward as the first dark shapes descended through the yellow haze of the atmosphere. The raider craft were black and bladed, sleek as predatory fish, their hulls inscribed with patterns that hurt to look at directly. They came in low and fast, skimming the rooftops of the hab blocks, and from their flanks the Drukhari warriors leaped. I have fought many enemies of the Emperor. I have faced cultists and renegade guardsmen, and once, in my 3rd year of service, the remnants of a greenskin warband on Kalos Prime. But nothing I had encountered prepared me for the speed of the Drukhari. They moved like liquid shadow, their segmented armor flowing with their bodies, their weapons already firing as they descended. Splinter rifles, the crystalline projectiles they use, coated in toxins that cause agony beyond description, designed not to kill, but to incapacitate, to paralyze their victims while leaving them conscious and screaming so that the pain can be savored. The first volley hit the crowd in the transit corridor. Workers fell. Not dead. Not yet, but writhing. Their mouths open in silent screams as the neurotoxins locked their muscles and set every nerve ending alight. The Drukhari landed among them like vultures among carrion, moving through the fallen with practiced efficiency. Snapping restraint collars around necks and wrists, hauling their victims toward the raider craft that hovered above with their cargo bays open and waiting. They were not fighting. They were shopping. I opened fire. The first round from my bolter took a Drukhari warrior in the chest and detonated a half-second later, the mass-reactive warhead blowing outward through the alien's torso in a spray of dark blood and fragmenting armor. The warrior dropped, and for a moment the others around it paused, their helmeted heads turning toward me with a synchronicity that was almost beautiful in its precision. 6 of them. 6 tall, angular figures in spiked armor, the color of a bruise, each one regarding me with the detached curiosity of a collector examining an unexpected specimen. Then they moved. 2 came at me directly, drawing long, curved blades that crackled with some form of disruption field. 2 more circled left, trying to flank. The remaining 2 raised their splinter rifles and fired. I caught the first volley on my pauldron, the crystalline shards shattering against the ceramite, and dropped to one knee, firing twice more. 1 shot went wide. The other hit the lad flanker in the hip and spun it around, the detonation tearing its leg free at the joint. The creature made no sound. It simply fell, and the one behind it stepped over the body without breaking stride. The blade wielders reached me. The first strike came low, aimed at the gap between my greave and my knee plate, and I turned it on my gauntlet, feeling the disruption field crackle against my armor's blessed ceramite. The second strike came high, for my throat, and I ducked it and put a bolt round into the attacker's midsection at point-blank range. The detonation threw me backward as much as it destroyed the xenos, and I hit the corridor wall hard enough to crack the plascrete and drive the air from my lungs. But I was up again in a second, armor servos compensating, bolter tracking the next target. It was at this point that Mathrada arrived. She came around the corner of the hab block like the wrath of the Emperor given physical form, her heavy bolter roaring, the muzzle flash strobing white in the dusty air. The stream of mass-reactive rounds tore through the remaining Drukhari in the corridor with the subtlety of an avalanche, and for a few seconds there was nothing but noise and light and the wet sound of xenos' bodies coming apart. When it stopped, the corridor was clear. Mathrada stood in a fog of gun smoke, her heavy bolter's barrel glowing cherry red, her armor spattered with alien blood that steamed where it touched the heated metal. "Rally point," she said, nodding toward the factory complex. We ran. The colony was in chaos. The Drukhari had hit multiple districts simultaneously, raider craft sweeping through the corridors like birds of prey, warriors pouring from their flanks to seize workers and drag them screaming into the sky. The colony's own defense force, a militia of armed overseers and factory guards equipped with las guns and flak vests, was fighting back with desperate courage, but they were outmatched in every way that mattered. The Drukhari were faster, better armed, better armored, and utterly without mercy. The militia was dying in the streets. We regrouped at the central factory complex, the largest structure in Calreth, a massive ferrocrete cathedral of industry that housed the primary bolt casing production lines. Eloine was already there, along with Galeth, Tuvia, and Cassine. Eloine had taken command of the militia forces in the area, roughly 200 men and women, and was organizing a defensive perimeter around the factory's main entrance. Her armor was scored with splinter impacts, and she had a shallow cut across her cheek where a shard had found the gap between her helm and her gorget, but she was functioning with the cold efficiency that defined her. 6 raider craft confirmed, she reported as Mathrada and I joined the line. Estimated enemy strength, 120 to 150 warriors plus crew. They are focusing on the residential districts. Factory complexes are secondary targets. They want the workers, not the machines, I said. Correct. Their objective is harvesting. If we can deny them access to the bulk of the population, they will withdraw. Drukhari do not sustain operations against determined resistance. It is not cost-effective for them. Cost-effective. She used that word. I remember it clearly because it struck me as obscene, applying economic logic to a slaving raid. But she was right. The Drukhari were raiders, not conquerors. They calculated their losses against their gains with the precision of merchants, and if the cost of staying exceeded the value of their haul, they would cut and run. Our job was to make the cost unbearable. We split the defense. Eloine, Galeth, and Tuvia held the factory complex with the militia, forming a hardened position that the civilians could shelter behind. Mathrada, Cassine, and I went hunting. The next 4 hours were the most intense combat of my life. We moved through the colony in a 3-woman kill team, hunting the Drukhari raiding parties as they swept through the Hab districts. We knew the layout. We had spent weeks patrolling every corridor, every junction, every transit way. The Drukhari did not know the ground as well as we did, and that made the difference. We ambushed them at choke points, caught them in crossfires, drove them out of residential blocks with massed bolter fire, and into kill zones where Mathra's heavy bolter could do its terrible work. We moved fast and hit hard, and never stayed in one place long enough for them to pin us down. I killed 17 Drukhari in those 4 hours. I know the exact number because I counted, not out of pride, but out of a need to anchor myself in something concrete while the world dissolved into blood and noise and the screaming of people being dragged into the sky. 17 confirmed kills with my bolter, each one marked by the distinctive crack thump of a mass-reactive round finding its target, and the brief, bright burst of the warhead detonating inside alien flesh. I did not enjoy it. I have never enjoyed killing. But there was a clarity to it, a simplicity that had been absent from my life since I found that decree in the archive. These were xenos. They were taking human beings as slaves. There was no ambiguity, no hidden decree, no buried truth. There was only the enemy and the bolter and the prayer on my lips. And for those 4 hours, I was exactly what I was meant to be. The worst moment came near the end of the 3rd hour. We had pushed a raiding party into the open ground near the cargo rail terminus. The Drukhari were retreating toward a raider craft, and they were dragging captives with them. 18, maybe 20 people bound at the wrists, hauled across the dirt like livestock. Among them was a boy, no older than 14, fighting the cable, digging his heels in. A Drukhari warrior struck him across the face, and he fell, and they dragged him. We could have pursued. Phadra's heavy bolter had the range, but 300 meters to our left, a hab block was burning. Incendiary charges had set the upper levels alight, and I could see figures trapped behind the windows, pounding on the transparent panels. If we went after the captives, those people would burn. If we went to the hab block, the captives would be taken. I chose the hab block. We saved 41 people from that building. The 20 captives at the rail terminus did not go home. I watched the raider craft lift with them dangling from its belly clamps, rising through the yellow haze. The boy was among them. I saw his face, small and distant, turned back toward the colony as the craft ascended. He had stopped fighting. He was just looking. And then he was gone. Phadra stood beside me as the raider disappeared into the clouds. She had not lowered her heavy bolter, even though there was nothing left to shoot. For a long moment she said nothing, and then she spoke, and her voice was as flat and quiet as it always was, and it carried more weight than anyone else could have given it. "You picked the ones we could save. That is the only rule we have." She did not look at me when she said it. She did not need to. We walked toward the next contact without another word, and I have carried her sentence with me ever since, because it was the only absolution any of us would ever offer for the things we did that day. We lost people. The militia fought with extraordinary bravery. Men and women who had never held a weapon in anger, standing shoulder to shoulder in the corridors and firing their last guns into the oncoming aliens with the grim determination of people defending their homes. But bravery is not armor, and las guns are not bolters, and the Drukhari splinter weapons did not discriminate between the brave and the merely present. By the time the raiding parties began to withdraw, pulling back to their craft with their holds full of captives, we had lost over 300 militia dead and twice that many wounded. The civilian casualties were worse. We would not have a final count for days, but the early estimates suggested that the Drukhari had taken between 4,000 and 5,000 people. 4,000 colonists, workers, men and women and children, dragged screaming into the sky and carried through the webway to a place of infinite cruelty from which they would never return. I found Vosh's body near the furnace works. He had been killed by a splinter volley while trying to shield 2 younger workers, a man and a woman who had survived because his bulk had absorbed the worst of the barrage. The toxins had done their work on him. His face was locked in an expression of such agony that I had to look away. I knelt beside him and said the prayer for the departed, and when I was done I noticed that his right hand was clenched around something. I pried his fingers open. Inside was a small clay figure, roughly made with elongated arms. He had kept one, hidden it from us during the confiscation, concealed it somewhere we did not search, and carried it with him into his last moment on this world. I closed his fingers around it again and left it with him. The aftermath of the raid was chaos of a different kind. Medical teams worked through the night, Galeth among them, triaging the wounded and treating the toxin-afflicted as best they could with the colony's limited pharmaceutical supplies. The dead were collected and prepared for cremation. The colony's Vox network, damaged in the attack, was patched together by the communications crew, and Elohim sent an emergency astropathic signal to the sector fleet requesting military support. Karnas was everywhere, organizing, directing, coordinating the relief effort with the same crisp efficiency she had shown since our arrival. Whatever else she was, whatever crimes she was party to, she was an effective administrator. I watched her and felt something I had not expected. Not anger, not respect. Something colder. Because I had noticed something during the fighting. The militia's ammunition reserves had run critically low within the first 2 hours. Las gunpowder cells had to be rationed, and 2 defensive hardpoints in the outer districts had been abandoned entirely because the troops simply ran out of things to shoot. The militia quartermaster told me that the colony's munitions stockpile was at 60% of regulation levels and had been for years. She did not know why. She had filed requisition requests with the administratum and been told that her allocation matched the colony's reported output. But it did not match the actual output, because 2% of everything Nathraxa Septimus produced had been vanishing into Bishop Thrace's supply chain for years. 2% of bolt casings, 2% of las power cells. Siphoned away to fill the holds of private haulers while the colony's own defenders went undersupplied. The Drukhari had taken 4,000 people, and some portion of that number could be attributed directly to the fact that the men and women fighting to protect them did not have enough ammunition to hold their positions. Thrace had not just stolen munitions, he had stolen the colony's ability to defend itself. The response to our distress signal came from the sector fleet in the form of a single patrol corvette that entered orbit 4 days after the raid, scanned for remaining xenos signatures, found none, and departed within 12 hours. That was the extent of the Imperium's military aid. 1 corvette, 1 scan, 1 signature in the orbital traffic logs. The galaxy had larger problems than a backwater colony that had lost 4,000 workers to a xenos raid. But 5 days after the corvette left, a strike cruiser entered orbit. The Vox channels lit up with the identifying codes of the Order of the Argent Shroud. Not our order. The Argent Shroud, one of the major orders militant, with resources and authority that dwarfed our small detachment, and at their head was Canoness Vorith Drail. I would learn later that Drail had been en route to Nathraxa Septimus before the raid ever happened. Thrace had dispatched her weeks prior. Our initial compliance reports had been the pretext he needed to justify sending a full company for a purge. Drail's arrival 9 days after the raid was not a rescue. It was a schedule, and the Drukhari attack was nothing more than an inconvenient overlap. I should describe Canoness Drail, because understanding what happened next requires understanding her. She was tall, even for a sister of battle, and she wore her white and silver armor with the unconscious grace of someone who had been born in it. Her face was severe, marked by a scar from temple to jaw, and her eyes were the pale blue of deep ice. She had served the Argent Shroud for over 30 years and commanded with absolute authority. She was, by every measure the Sororitas valued, a perfect canoness. She was also a personal associate of Bishop Thrace. Drael made planetfall with a full company. 60 sisters in gleaming white power armor, supported by 3 immolator transports and an exorcist missile launcher platform. They deployed across the colony like a silver tide. The colonists watched them arrive with wonder tempered by exhaustion and grief. These people had just survived a xenos raid. The arrival of more sororitas should have been a comfort. It was not. Because Canoness Drael had not come to help. She made this clear within hours of her arrival, during a command briefing that included Eloine, Carnass, and the senior militia officers. I was not present, but Kessin was standing guard at the door and heard everything. Drael's orders were to conduct a full-scale faith purge. She had the compliance reports. She had Thrace's authority. The Drukhari raid was an inconvenience she acknowledged with a single sentence before moving to the operational agenda. The dead and the taken were noted in her log as pre-existing population reduction and factored into her assessment calculations. Nothing more. Kessin came to me that night, her face white, her hands trembling. "She is going to burn the chapels," Kessin said. "All 42 of them. She is going to execute the local clergy for fostering heretical practice. She is going to relocate the population to labor camps under sororitas supervision and conduct individual faith assessments of every adult colonist. Anyone who fails the assessment will be classified as a heretic and dealt with accordingly." Dealt with accordingly. She used those words. "And the decree? Did Drael hear about it?" Kessin looked at me with an expression that was part fear and part fury. Eloine raised the decree with Drael during the briefing, mentioned Gorvain's name, the date, the sanction. Drael dismissed it, said the bishop's current authority superseded a 4-century-old ruling, and that was the end of the discussion. As for the logistics data, I never showed it to Eloine. I kept it back. I no longer trust the chain of command to handle anything that leads back to Thrace. But the decree alone should have been enough. It was not.
Eloine tried, and Drael shut her down.
Eloine followed the chain of command. She always follows the chain of command, Mathrada. That is what she does. That is all she does. I stood there in the dust and the dark, listening to the colony groan around me, and I understood with perfect clarity that the chain of command had been corrupted from the top down. The purge was not about faith. It was about control. Thrace needed the colony compliant, its population too frightened to ask questions about missing bolt casings. The purge would replace the colony's identity with terror, its traditions with obedience, its faith with fear. And when it was over, Thrace would have a silent, docile workforce that never looked too closely at where their output disappeared to. I had 2 pieces of evidence that could stop this: the decree and the logistics data. But I was one sister on a world now occupied by 60 more, commanded by a canoness who answered to the man I was trying to expose. My only option was to get the evidence off-world, to the Synod itself. But the Synod was 1,000 light-years away, and I was trapped on a dusty factory world, watching a purge begin. The purge began on the 3rd day after Drael's arrival. It started with the chapels, as Kessin had predicted. Teams of Argent Shroud Sisters moved through each of the 42 worship sites in Calreth, stripping them of all devotional materials, all local iconography, everything that was not standard issue ecclesiarchal furniture. The pews were left, the altars were left, the aquillas were left. But the coloured glass windows, handcrafted by local artisans over centuries, were smashed. The carved stone reliefs depicting the emperor as a labourer, as a builder, as a worker standing alongside his people were chiselled from the walls and broken into rubble. The prayer books that contained the old hymns were collected and burned in the factory yards, the smoke rising in thin columns that the colonists watched from their hab-block windows with faces I cannot describe, because there are no words in Gothic or any other language for the expression of a people watching their heritage being incinerated by the very institution that was supposed to protect it. Deacon Hesketh was arrested on the first day. 2 sisters of the Argent Shroud came to his chapel, the old one with the wooden floor and the coloured glass window, and they bound his wrists and led him away. He did not resist. He went with them quietly, his head bowed, his lips moving in prayer. I was not there when it happened. I heard about it afterward, from a militia officer who had watched from across the street. The officer told me that Hesketh had paused at the door of the chapel and looked back, just once, at the room where he had prayed every evening for 30 years. Then he turned and walked out, and the sisters escorted him to a holding cell in the administrative tower's basement. I went to see him. This was a risk. Drayle had posted guards on the detention level, but my credentials allowed me limited access for a post-arrest interview. The guards logged my entry and permitted me 10 minutes. The cells had no listening devices. The detention block had been converted from a storage basement in days, its security physical rather than electronic. Walls and locks, not vox taps. I found Hesketh sitting on a bench with his hands folded in his lap. He looked up when I entered, and he smiled, that same tired, sad smile. "I knew this was coming," he said. "I have known it for months. Since before you arrived. Bishop Thrace sent word to Carnass last year that the colony was being reviewed for compliance. Carnass sealed the archive the same week. I understood then what was happening." "And you said nothing?" "I said nothing to the Ecclesiarchy because the Ecclesiarchy was the source of the threat. I said nothing to you because you were agents of that same authority. I waited for you to see for yourself, because testimony from a local deacon would be dismissed as self-serving. Testimony from a sister of battle would not." He was right. I knew he was right. A deacon defending his parish traditions would be seen as biased, possibly complicit. A sister of battle presenting evidence of institutional corruption would carry weight. Not guaranteed weight, not in a system as vast and Byzantine as the Ecclesiarchy, but weight nonetheless. Hesketh had played a longer game than I had given him credit for, and the cost of that patience was a cell with a drain in the floor. "They will execute you," I said. "Probably. Drayle is thorough. She will conduct a trial because she values procedure, but the outcome is predetermined. I am the senior cleric of a colony classified as heretical. My fate was sealed the moment Father Dreth filed his report. I have the decree, and more than that. My sister Kessine found evidence that Thrace is skimming bolt casings from this colony through a private supply chain. This entire operation, the compliance mission, the purge, all of it is a cover for his corruption." Hesketh closed his eyes. For a moment, the composure that had sustained him through days of detention wavered, and I saw something cross his face that might have been grief or vindication, or both at once. "Carnass," he said quietly. "I always suspected her involvement ran deeper than faith compliance. The archive was sealed too quickly, too cleanly. An ecclesiarchal dispute does not require hiding administrative records unless the administration itself is compromised. He opened his eyes. You need to get it out. The decree and whatever your sister found. To someone beyond Thrace's reach. I know. I am working on it. He looked at me for a long time, his brown eyes steady and warm. You are a good woman, Sister Mathrada. The Emperor does not ask us to be perfect. He asks us to be faithful. You have been faithful, not to the institution, but to the truth. That is harder. That is the faith that matters. I left him there because I had no choice. I could not break him out. I could not challenge his arrest. All I could do was carry the evidence that might, eventually, vindicate him. And that meant finding a way off Nathraxa Septimus. The opportunity came from an unexpected source. Among the chaos of the post-raid recovery, a merchant vessel had arrived in orbit, the Pale Contrition, a cargo hauler under contract to the Departamento Munitorum. It was scheduled to pick up a shipment of bolt casings and las power cells, a routine collection that happened every 8 weeks. The ship's captain, a veteran void trader named Helk Serrano, had been informed of the Drukhari raid and was understandably nervous about lingering in orbit, but his contract required him to complete the pickup, and the Munitorum did not accept excuses. He was going to be on the ground for approximately 72 hours while the cargo was loaded. And then he was leaving, whether the colony was in crisis or not. I needed to be on that ship, or at the very least, I needed to get the evidence onto it. The problem was Drael. The Canoness had locked down the colony's transit infrastructure. No one was leaving without her authorization. The landing platforms were under Argent Shroud control, the shuttle bays sealed, the orbital communications monitored. But Drael did not know the full scope of the evidence. Eloine had mentioned the decree verbally, and Drael had dismissed it as the irrelevant ruling of a long-dead archbishop. She knew nothing about the logistics data, the supply chain, the connection to Thrace's corruption. That evidence existed only on Cassine's encrypted slate and in the transcription against my skin. I used that ignorance the way a soldier uses terrain. Cassine and I had encrypted the logistics data on a data slug in her gauntlet's maintenance cavity. The decree was still against the skin of my back. I needed to get both to Serrano and persuade him to carry them to the Synod. I went to Galeth. Of all my squad, Galeth was the one I trusted most, because she had compassion. She had spent the days since the raid treating wounded colonists in the field hospital, holding dying workers in her arms and hearing their last prayers, the old prayers, the ones the purge was designed to erase. When I told her what I knew, she did not hesitate. What do you need me to do?
A distraction. Something that pulls the guards away from landing platform Sigma 18 for 15 minutes.
The field hospital has been requesting an emergency pharmaceutical resupply from orbit. If I flag it as critical through the Argent Shroud's logistics chain, it will require a security escort to the platform. That pulls at least 4 sisters from the guard detail. Do it. She did it. On the second day of the Pale Contrition's loading operation, Galeth filed her request, and the machinery of bureaucratic urgency ground into motion. 4 Argent Shroud sisters were redeployed from the platform to the medical staging area. 2 remained on guard. I could handle 2. I did not fight them. Fighting Sisters of the Argent Shroud would have been a declaration of war against a fellow order, an act of treason against the Sororitas itself. Instead, I walked directly to the platform with my credentials displayed, my bolter mag-locked to my thigh, my demeanor that of a compliance officer conducting routine business. The guards checked my identity, verified my orders, which were real. Elohim had assigned me to a perimeter patrol that passed near the platform and let me through. I was inside. Captain Serrano was in the loading bay, supervising the cargo operation from a battered command throne that had been bolted to the deck of his shuttle. He was a weathered man, 60 or so, with a face like a dried riverbed and eyes that had seen too many ports and too many customs inspectors to be impressed by anything. He looked at me the way all civilian captains look at sororitas, with a mixture of respect and wariness, the way you might look at a large, well-trained guard dog that you were not entirely sure was on your side. I had perhaps 10 minutes before the guard rotation brought fresh sisters back to the platform. Galeth's distraction had brought 15, but 5 had been eaten by my movement from patrol route to platform and the credential checks at the checkpoint. I used what was left efficiently. Captain Serrano, I am Sister Mathrada Grieve, Order of the Ashen Covenant. I need you to carry a sealed package to the diocesan seat on Orphelia Tertius and deliver it to Synod Representative Aldane Morve. The package contains evidence of institutional corruption within the Diocese of the Orphelian Reach. Lives depend on its delivery. Serrano looked at me for a long moment. Then he scratched his chin, which was stubbled and grey, and said, I am a cargo hauler under munitorum contract. My route takes me through Orphelia Tertius on the return leg. But I am not a courier for the Ecclesiarchy, and I have no interest in getting involved in church politics. This is not politics. This is corruption. A bishop is running a black market munitions operation through this colony, and he is using a faith purge to cover it. 34 million people are being persecuted to protect a supply chain. And if I carry this package and it turns out to be exactly what you say, I become a target for this bishop. If you carry this package and it reaches the synod, the bishop will have far larger concerns than one cargo captain. If you do not carry it, the purge continues. People will die. A deacon who has served faithfully for 30 years will be executed for heresy that is not heresy. Serrano was quiet. The loading mechanisms hummed and clanked around us, crates of bolt casings being hauled into the Pale Contrition's hold by servitor crews. How do I know you are telling the truth? You do not. But I am a sister of battle, and I am asking you to carry a package, not to fight a war. The risk to you is minimal. The potential consequence of inaction is the destruction of a community. He looked at me. He looked at the loading bay, at the crates of bolt casings being stacked in his hold, at the grey sky of Nathraxa Septimus, visible through the bay's atmospheric shield. Then he held out his hand. I gave him the data slug and the transcribed decree, sealed in a plastic envelope that Cassine had prepared. He took them, turned the envelope over once, and slipped it inside his jacket. Orphelia Tertius, Synod Representative Morve, you owe me a favour, sister. I owe you more than that. I turned to leave and walked directly into Sister Palatine Vyrath of the Argent Shroud. She had not been there when I entered. She had arrived during my conversation with Serrano, walking onto the platform with the casual authority of an officer conducting a spot inspection. The guards would have admitted her without question. She was standing at the entrance to the loading bay, her white and silver armor catching the grey light from the atmospheric shield, her helm under one arm, and her pale eyes fixed on me with the flat, professional interest of an officer encountering something slightly out of place. She was Drael's second in command. She had authority over every operation on this platform, and she was looking at me as though trying to decide whether I was a minor irregularity or a major one. Sister Grieve, the Ashen Covenant. You are assigned to perimeter patrol in the eastern sectors. Correct, Palatine. My route passes this platform. I received a report from one of the loading crew about a potential structural issue with Bay 4's cargo clamp. I came to verify before filing a maintenance request. The lie came out of me with a fluidity that would have horrified the novitiate I had been 10 years ago. Smooth, specific, exactly the kind of mundane technical concern that no one would question, but anyone might check. Virath looked at me. She looked past me at Serrano, who was sitting on his command throne, picking his teeth with a metal stylus, the very picture of bored disinterest. She looked at the loading bay, at the cargo clamps, at the servitors stacking crates.
Bay 4's clamp was serviced last cycle,
she said. Then the report was in error. I will update accordingly. My apologies for the disturbance, Palatine. A pause. 3 seconds, maybe 4, that stretched like wire. Virath was not a fool. She had not reached her rank by accepting explanations at face value. I could see the calculation behind her eyes, the professional assessment of whether this situation warranted further scrutiny or whether it was simply one of the 1,000 trivial misunderstandings that cluttered any military operation. My heart was hammering against my breastplate so hard I was certain she could hear it through the ceramite.
"Carry on, sister,"
she said. I walked past her, through the platform checkpoint, down the access ramp, and back onto my patrol route. I did not run. I did not look back. I maintained the steady, measured stride of a sister conducting her duties, and I recited the litany of composure under my breath with every step, and I did not stop reciting it until I was 3 blocks away and my hands had stopped trembling. The purge intensified. Drayle was methodical. She divided the colony into sectors and processed them one by one, each sector sealed off, each adult resident subjected to a faith assessment conducted by Argent Shroud sisters, trained in doctrinal interrogation. The assessments were brutal. Hours of questioning, recitation tests, theological examinations designed to identify any trace of heterodox belief. Workers who had sung the old hymns for decades were asked to denounce them as heretical. Parents who had kept labourers of the throne in their homes for generations were asked to confess their deviation and submit to penitential correction. Most complied. They had no choice. The alternative was classification as a heretic, which on a world under sororitas jurisdiction meant anything from forced labour in a penal detachment to summary execution. The colonists of Nathraxa Septimus were not martyrs. They were ordinary people, workers and parents and children who wanted to live and were willing to say whatever the armoured women with bolters required them to say in order to survive. They renounced their traditions. They confessed sins they had not committed. They knelt and wept and begged forgiveness for the crime of loving the Emperor in the wrong way. One assessment broke something in me that I do not think has ever fully mended. An old woman. 83 standard years, a retired press operator named Mather Colloon, who had worked the bolt casing line for 51 years. She sat across from me in the assessment chamber and could not stop shaking. Not from cold. From the effort of trying to remember the approved litanies that we had distributed only weeks before. Litanies meant to replace the prayers she had recited every day of her adult life. She kept starting and stopping, her lips moving, her eyes searching the ceiling as though the words might be written there. 60 years of daily repetition had carved the old prayers into her brain like engravings in stone. The new ones would not stick. "Please, Holy Sister," she whispered. "I know them. I have been practicing. My granddaughter helps me every evening. I just cannot find them right now. Please." I passed her. I marked her assessment as compliant. It was the first lie I had ever written in an official document, and I would do it again without hesitation. Tuvia was not so fortunate. On the 9th day of the purge, during her rotation of assessments in the 4th Labour District, she came to me in the corridor outside the processing rooms. Her face was white, not from her armor's environmental systems, but from something inside her that had cracked. She was 23 years old, the youngest of our squad, and she had joined the Sororitas with the burning certainty of a convert, the kind of faith that runs hot and bright and does not know how to bend without breaking. "I cannot do this, Mathrada," she said. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were not. "I had a father and his daughter. The girl was 12. She was holding her father's hand under the table, and he was reciting the approved litanies perfectly, word for word, and she was mouthing along with him because he had taught her overnight so she would not fail. And I was watching this man teach his child to lie in the name of the Emperor, and I thought, this is what we are doing. We are teaching the faithful to lie. We are making liars out of believers." I did not know what to say, so I said the only thing I could. "Finish your rotation. Conduct the assessments. Pass everyone who shows effort. We will not be here forever." "And when we leave? What happens to these people? They go back to their lives and pretend that none of this happened? They forget the hymns their grandmothers sang and the figures their grandfathers carved, and they just accept that it is gone."
"Some of them will, some will not. That is not ours to decide."
"Then what is ours to decide, Mathrada? Because I joined this order to protect the Emperor's people, and all I have done on this world is hurt them." She went back. She finished her rotation. She conducted every assessment that remained on her schedule with professional efficiency, and the dead, hollow eyes of a woman performing an act she found morally unbearable. I watched her and saw myself, and I wondered whether this was what the Imperium did to all of its servants eventually, whether it took the brightest and most devoted and ground them down until they could function without feeling, until duty was not a calling but an anesthetic. I participated in this. I want to be clear about that. I conducted faith assessments alongside my squad because refusal would have meant arrest and the probable discovery of what I had done with the evidence. If Drele learned that I had smuggled documents off-world, Kessin and Galeth would be implicated. The evidence might be intercepted, so I participated. I became part of the machine that was grinding these people down, and I told myself that it was temporary, that justice was coming. I conducted 114 faith assessments over the course of the purge. I remember every face, not every name, but every face. The fear in their eyes when they sat down across from me, the way their hands trembled when they recited the approved litanies, the flat, dead tone of their voices when they denounced the traditions their grandparents had taught them. I conducted these assessments with the same professional efficiency I had brought to every other duty in my career, and I hated every second of it. And that hatred was a fire inside my chest that I fed with prayer and duty and the desperate hope that I had not sacrificed my soul for nothing. Eloine said nothing to me during this period. Her manner had shifted in a way that was subtle but unmistakable. She was not cold. She was simply absent, as though the person I had known for years had stepped behind a curtain and left a functionary in her place. I think she knew the truth. I think she had known since I showed her the decree, and she had chosen to ignore it because acknowledging it would have required her to act, and acting would have required her to disobey. And Eloane could not disobey. Obedience was not just her training. It was her identity, and asking her to defy the chain of command was like asking her to stop breathing. I did not blame her. I do not blame her now. The trial of Deacon Hesketh took place on the 19th day after Drael's arrival. It was held in the main hall of the administrative tower, a large room that Drael had converted into a makeshift ecclesiastical court. Colonists were permitted to attend. Drael insisted on this. She wanted witnesses. She wanted the population to see justice administered, to understand the consequences of deviation, to carry the memory of this proceeding back to their hab blocks and their factories and their children. The hall was full. Workers stood shoulder to shoulder along the walls, pressed into every available space. Their dust-grey faces turned toward the bench where Drael sat in her white and silver armor with the cold authority of a woman who had never once questioned her right to judge. Hesketh was brought in wearing prisoner's rags, his wrists bound with plastic restraints, his face gaunt from weeks of detention. He had lost weight. The gentle softness that had characterized his features when I first met him was gone, replaced by the sharp angles of a man whose body was consuming itself. But he walked without assistance, without stumbling, and when he reached the center of the hall, he stood before Drael's bench with the quiet dignity of a man who had already made his peace with whatever was coming. The charges were read by an Argent Shroud sister, serving as judicial scribe, her voice flat and mechanical, reciting the accusations as though they were inventory entries. Fostering heretical worship practices, failing to report doctrinal deviation, complicity in the spiritual corruption of an imperial population. Each charge carried a penalty up to and including death. The colonists in the hall listened to these charges in absolute silence. No murmur, no gasp, no sound at all. They had learned silence. We had taught it to them. Hesketh was allowed to speak in his defense. He spoke for 11 minutes. He spoke clearly, without notes, without raising his voice, without pleading. He described the history of the colony's traditions. He referenced Archbishop Gorvain's decree, by name, by date, by content. He stated that the practices he was accused of fostering had been formally sanctioned by ecclesiarchal authority, and that no subsequent ruling had revoked that sanction. He stated that the population of Nathraxa Septimus was among the most devout in the Orphelian Reach, with tithe compliance rates above 98% for over 2 centuries. He stated that the faith of these people was real, was sincere, was powerful, and that destroying it in the name of compliance was a betrayal of the Emperor's trust. Drael listened to this without expression. When Hesketh finished, she asked him a single question. "Deacon, do you repent?" Hesketh looked at her. He looked at the sisters flanking the bench, at the armoured women who held his life in their judgment. He looked at me, standing at the back of the room in my patrol position, and his eyes held mine for a moment that stretched like a wire being pulled taut. "I repent nothing," he said. "I have served the Emperor faithfully for 30 years. If you kill me for it, then it is you who answer to him, not I." Drael sentenced him to death, execution by bolter, to be carried out at dawn the following day. The hall erupted, not in protest, not in shouts or cries, but in a sound I had never heard before and hope never to hear again. a low collective exhalation, hundreds of people releasing the same breath at the same moment, a sound like wind moving through an empty building. Some of the older colonists covered their faces. A woman in the front row, who I later learned was Hesketh's housekeeper of 20 years, sank to her knees without a word and stayed there, motionless, staring at nothing. The workers along the walls pressed closer together, as though proximity to each other could provide some protection against what they had just heard. Hesketh alone was still. He looked at Drael, and he nodded, once, the way a man nods when someone confirms something he already knew. They led him out. The colonists parted for him, and as he passed, hands reached out, not grasping, not pulling, just touching. Fingertips brushing his arms, his shoulders, the hem of his rags, a gesture of farewell that was also a gesture of reverence, the last laying of hands this colony would ever perform for the man who had shepherded them for 30 years. Drael's guards did not stop it. Perhaps they did not understand what they were seeing. Perhaps they did, and chose not to interfere. I watched from the back of the room, and I memorized every detail, because someone had to remember, and I had decided that someone would be me. I was not assigned to the execution detail. Eloine was. Drael chose her deliberately. I am certain of it. By placing the bolter in an Ashen Covenant sister's hands, Drael ensured that our order shared the blood. We could not later claim distance from the purge. We could not file a report saying we had been observers. Eloine's trigger finger made us accomplices, and Drael understood that calculation as clearly as she understood any tactical deployment. Eloine accepted the assignment without comment, checked her bolter, and reported to the yard at the appointed hour. I heard the single shot from my quarters, a flat, final sound that echoed off the ferrocrete walls of the administrative tower and faded into the endless hum of the factories. The colonists heard it too. Every worker on the morning shift, every family in the hab blocks, every child walking to the nutrition stations. They heard the shot, and they knew what it meant. Because word travels through a colony like Nathraxa Septimus, the way vibration travels through metal, fast and impossible to stop. By midday, every person in Calrath knew that Deacon Hesketh was dead. By evening, every person in every labor district on the planet knew. And something changed. Not a rebellion, not a protest, nothing so dramatic or so dangerous. Something quieter. Something that settled over the colony like dust over the factory floors. A silence that was not the absence of sound, but the absence of something else. Hope, maybe. Or trust. Or the last fragile thread connecting these people to the institution that claimed to speak for their god. I walked the corridors that evening, alone, on a patrol that no one had assigned me. The workers passed me without kneeling, without murmuring "by the throne," without any of the small gestures of deference that had defined their interactions with us since we arrived. They looked at me and then looked away, not in fear, not in hostility, but with an emptiness that was worse than either. They had given us everything we asked for. Their figures, their hymns, their rituals, their confessions, and we had taken their pastor. There was nothing left for them to give, and nothing left for us to take, and they knew it, and we knew it, and the knowledge hung between us like smoke. The purge continued for another 31 days after Hesketh's execution. 50 days in total, from start to finish. 50 days of faith assessments and chapel clearances and public denunciations and the slow, systematic dismantling of everything that had made Nathraxa Septimus more than just another production line stamped with the Aquila. When it was over, Dryle declared the colony purified, filed her report, and departed with her company. She left behind a garrison of 12 sisters to maintain compliance, along with a newly appointed confessor, a young man named Pelion Darst, freshly graduated from seminary, who arrived with a crate of approved devotional materials and the mandate to rebuild what we had torn down. He asked me whether the population was receptive to imperial guidance. I told him they were compliant. He did not understand the difference. My squad was recalled 3 weeks after the purge ended. Orders from the Ashen Covenant's priory on Veredicia 3, routine reassignment to a new operational theatre. We left Nathraxa Septimus on a transport shuttle that took us to an orbiting frigate, and from there we re-entered the warp. I watched the planet shrink in the viewing port until it was just a speck, a faint discoloration against the void, and then it was gone. The transit back to Veredicia 3 took 57 days. I spent them in the ship's chapel, on my knees, praying. But the prayers were different now. Halting, fragmented, shot through with silences I could not fill. I was not losing my faith. What happened on Nathraxa Septimus was not a story about a sister of battle who stopped believing. I never stopped believing. I still believe. What I lost was certainty. The unquestioning conviction that the institutions which carried the Emperor's name also carried his will. That loss was immense. Certainty is the foundation of everything a sister of battle is. We do not question because questioning is unnecessary. Remove the certainty, and you remove the ground beneath our feet. You leave us standing in the air, still armed, still armored, still dangerous, but with nothing beneath us but the long fall. I did not fall. I stood in that emptiness, and I found something else to stand on. The memory of Vosh, clutching his clay figure as the toxins killed him. The sound of Hesketh's voice telling Drale that he repented nothing. The face of the little girl who gave me a labourer of the throne and ran off smiling. I stood on those things, and they held me. On Veredicia 3, I resumed my duties. Drills, patrols, devotional cycles, the machinery of sororitas life that grinds on regardless of what any individual sister carries inside her. I did not speak of Nathraxa Septimus, neither did Cassine nor Galeth. We had made a silent pact, the three of us, that the evidence was out of our hands now, and that our only course was to wait and to endure, and to hope that the truth would find its way to someone who could act on it. Eloine, Phaedra, and Tuvia returned to the Order's operational roster without visible effect. Whatever they thought about what had happened, they kept it behind the same walls that the Sororitas builds in all of us, the walls of duty and discipline, and the practiced art of not examining things too closely. I waited. 1 month. 3 months, 6 months, a year. Nothing happened. No investigation was announced. No recall orders were issued. The silence was worse than any battle. In combat, you can act. In silence, there is nothing but the slow corrosion of hope. I developed a ritual. Every 7th day, on the day the Priory's astropathic choir transmitted its weekly message batch, I would find a reason to pass the communications chamber and listen for incoming traffic bearing synod codes. I never asked directly. I simply passed by and listened and heard nothing, and waited another 7 days. Cassine and I met once a month in the Priory's botanical nave, exchanging looks that said everything words could not. A subtle shake of her head meaning no word yet. A brief press of my hand on her arm, meaning stay the course. I began to doubt. Not the evidence, not the truth of what we had found, but the possibility that truth had any power in the face of institutional inertia. The Ecclesiarchy was a machine the size of a galaxy, and we had dropped a pebble into its works, and the machine ground on as though the pebble did not exist. I imagined the envelope sitting in a pile on some functionary's desk on Ophelia Tertius, unopened, buried under the daily avalanche of reports that constituted the administrative life of a sector capital. I began to think that I had risked everything for nothing, that Hesketh had died for nothing, that the traditions of Nathraxa Septimus had been erased for nothing. And then, 14 months after my return to Veridicia III, I was summoned to the Priory's communications chamber to receive a priority astropathic transmission. The message was brief, carried the seal of the Synod of the Orphelian Reach, and was addressed to me by name. Bishop Valdron Thrace had been arrested by the Synod's Investigative Council on charges of corruption, misappropriation of military material, and abuse of ecclesiarchal authority. The investigation had been initiated based on evidence delivered by a civilian merchant captain to Synod representative Aldane Morva on Ophelia Tertius. Thrace had been removed from his position and confined pending trial. Prefect Carnas had been arrested separately by the Administratum on charges of tithe fraud. The second piece of information was that Canoness Drael had submitted a formal statement declaring she had conducted the purge in good faith, based on orders she believed legitimate. The Synod accepted this. Drael was not charged, not investigated, not disciplined. Her purge was reclassified as an operational overreach, conducted under fraudulent pretenses, and the matter was considered resolved. Resolved. As though you could resolve the destruction of 4 centuries of culture with a reclassification. The chapels had been gutted, the hymns silenced, the traditions burned. Deacon Hesketh was dead. His body had been cremated without ceremony, and his ashes scattered on the alkaline flats west of Calreth. No bolt casing in his hand, no hymn at his pyre. He died as a condemned heretic, and the posthumous acknowledgement that his condemnation was unjust did not change the manner of his dying. The Synod issued a formal rescission of the purge's findings. The traditions of Nathraxa Septimus were retroactively recognized as legitimate expressions of the imperial creed, consistent with Archbishop Gorvain's original decree. The colony's population was to be informed that their faith had been validated and that they were free to resume their traditional practices. A new deacon would be appointed to oversee the restoration of the colony's spiritual life. I wonder sometimes whether any of it was restored. Whether the colonists, after everything they had been through, after the confiscations and the denunciations and the faith assessments and the execution of their beloved pastor, had the will or the desire to go back to the old ways. Fear is a powerful thing. It rewires people. Once you have been told that your prayer is a sin and your devotion is heresy, and once you have seen the armored enforcers of that judgment walk your streets and enter your homes and carry away the objects your grandparents held sacred, it is very difficult to believe that it is safe to pray the old way again, even after someone in a distant palace signs a piece of paper saying you can. I learned years later from a transit chaplain who had passed through the Orphelian subsector that the colony did attempt a restoration. A new deacon was appointed, a woman named Avelia Dren, who commissioned new clay figures from the oldest craft workers who still remembered how to make them. She recovered fragments of the old hymns from elderly colonists who had learned them in childhood. She even attempted to reconstruct the coloured glass window in Hesketh's chapel. But it was not the same. The colonists treated the restored traditions with a careful reverence that was closer to museum curation than living faith. They handled the new figures gently, placed them on shelves rather than carrying them to the factories. They sang the recovered hymns in chapel, but not in the corridors, not during shift changes, not in the spontaneous way they once had. The laying of hands continued, but workers performed it self-consciously, glancing over their shoulders, as though expecting armoured figures to appear at any moment and tell them to stop. The traditions survived, technically. The spirit behind them was gone. You cannot burn a thing and then hand someone the ashes and call it restoration. The thousands of colonists taken by the Drukhari were never recovered. They never are. Somewhere in the twisted depths of Komorach, in the oubliettes and pain theatres of the Dark City, those men and women and children exist in a state that cannot be called life and should not be described in detail. I pray for them. Every evening, during my personal devotions, I add their names to my intercession list. All of them, even though I do not know most of their names. I pray for them by collective identity, the taken of Nathraxa Septimus, and I ask the Emperor to grant them whatever mercy is possible in a place designed to make mercy extinct. I requested a copy of the Synod's findings. I read them in my cell on Veridicia 3, alone, in the hour before dawn, when the priory was silent, except for the distant murmur of the sisters who kept the midnight vigil. I read about Thrace's arrest. I read about Drael's exoneration. I read about the rescission. And when I was done, I sat on my cot and held the little clay figure that the girl in the market district had given me, the labourer of the throne, rough and brown and small enough to fit in my palm, and I held it for a long time. Sister Eloine transferred to a penitential assignment 6 months later. She did not explain her reasons, and I did not ask. I heard afterward that she had volunteered for the front lines of a war of faith in the Viridian Marches, the kind of assignment from which few returned. Whether she went seeking atonement or simply seeking an end, I do not know. We never spoke again. Sister Kessin left the Order's militant entirely and returned to the Dialogus. She said that her skills were better used in service to knowledge than to violence, and I believed her. And I mourned the loss of the finest legal mind I had ever known. Sister Galeth continued to serve as she always had, with quiet compassion and steady hands. She is still with the Ashen Covenant, still healing, still mending what she can. We do not speak of Nathraxa Septimus, but sometimes, in the refectory, our eyes meet across the table, and we share a look that says everything we cannot say aloud. Sister Phaedra continued her career without visible disruption, a soldier's soldier to the end. Sister Tuvia requested transfer to the Order's Dialogus Auxiliary 18 months after our return, citing a desire to serve through scholarship rather than combat. She was 25. She had the dead, hollow eyes of a woman twice her age. I signed her transfer recommendation without comment, and when she left the priory, I stood at the gate and watched her go, and I thought of her in that corridor on Nathraxa Septimus, 23 years old, and asking me what was ours to decide, and I wished I had given her a better answer. I hold no resentment toward any of them. They did their duty. In the sororitas, duty is everything, and I have learned that condemning someone for doing their duty while forgiving yourself for breaking yours is a hypocrisy I cannot afford. I served for 5 more years after Nathraxa Septimus. I fought well. My record shows commendations, citations. But something had changed in me. and eventually my superiors recognized it. I was reassigned to the Order's training cadre, placed in charge of instructing novitiates. It was not a punishment. It was an acknowledgement that my value to the Order lay not in pointing a bolter at the Emperor's enemies, but in teaching the next generation to ask questions that I had never been taught to ask. Whether the Order intended that lesson is another matter, but I teach it anyway, in the margins, in the silences between approved doctrine. I think of Nathraxa Septimus every day. I think of the factory floors and the grey sky and the hum of the presses stamping bolt casings that would arm soldiers who would never know the name of the world that made them. I think of Vosh and his furnace and his grandmother's clay figure. I think of Hesketh kneeling in his chapel with the coloured glass casting fragments of light across the wooden floor. I think of the little girl in the market, running away with the joy of a child who believes the universe is good and that holy things walk among us. I think of all the faces. The 114 faces that sat across from me during the faith assessments, trembling and reciting and denouncing and confessing and weeping, all of them faithful, every single one of them faithful, and none of them guilty of anything except loving the Emperor in a way that made a corrupt bishop uncomfortable. I think of Deacon Hesketh, standing in that courtroom with his hands bound, saying, "I repent nothing." I carry those memories the way the people of Nathraxa Septimus carried their bolt casings, one in each hand, a reminder of what it costs to serve. A reminder that the cost is paid not by the institution, but by the individual, not by the Ecclesiarchy, but by the deacon, not by the sororitas, but by the sister who holds the evidence and has to decide what to do with it. They told me it would be a simple assignment. They were wrong. It was the most important thing I have ever done, and the most terrible, and I would do it again. Not the purge, never the purge. But the rest of it, the archive and the decree and the package on the pale contrition, and the long wait for justice that arrived too late to save the man who deserved it most. I would do all of that again. The Emperor protects, but sometimes he asks us to do the protecting ourselves, even when what we are protecting his people from is us.